we have to be able to keep multiple things in view, right? If you could only look at the problem of wokeness and you couldn't acknowledge the problem of Trump and Trumpism and QAnon and the explosion of irrationality that was happening on the right and bigotry that was happening on the right.
In this video, Sam Harris joins Lex Fridman on the Lex Fridman podcast. Sam Harris tells Lex Fridman that a lot of people with platforms like Joe Rogan and Brett Weinstein are victims to what he calls audience capture, suggesting that they say what their audience wants them to say. With that, let's watch Sam Harris make a fool of himself when Lex Fridman asks if he's immune to audience capture.
But because you brought up Joe, he's somebody like you I look up to. I've learned a lot from him because I think who he is privately as a human being, also he's kind of the voice of curiosity to me. He inspired me that. So unending, open-minded curiosity, much like you are the voice of reason. They recently had a podcast. Joe had recently had a podcast with Jordan Peterson, and he brought you up saying they still have a hope for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any chance
saw that clip? Yeah.
Any chance you talk to Joe again and reinvigorate your friendship?
Yeah. Well, I reached out to him privately when I saw that clip.
Did you use the power of love?
Joe knows I love him and consider him a friend, right? So there's no issue there. He also knows I'll be happy to do his podcast when we get that together. You know, so there's no I've got no policy of not talking to Joe or not doing his podcast. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we got a little sideways along these same lines where, you know, we've talked about Brett and Elon and other people. It was never to that degree with Joe because Joe's in a very different lane, right? And consciously so. I mean, Joe is a stand-up comic who interviews, who just is interested in everything, interviews the widest conceivable variety of people, and just lets his interests collide with their expertise or, you know, lack of expertise. I mean, it's a super wide variety of people. He'll talk about anything, and he can always pull the ripcord, saying, you know, I don't know what the fuck I'm saying. I'm a comic. I'm stoned. We just drank too much, right? Like it's very entertaining. It's all in, you know, to my eye, it's all in good faith. I think Joe is an extraordinarily ethical, good person.
Also doesn't use Twitter. Doesn't really use Twitter.
Yeah. No, but the crucial difference though is that because he is an entertainer first. I mean, I'm not saying he's not smart and he doesn't understand things. I mean, what's potentially confusing is he's very smart and he's also very informed. His full-time job is you know, when he's not doing stand-up or doing color commentary for the UFC.
If you like watching videos like this one, like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Let's get back to the video.
His full-time job is talking to lots of very smart people at great length. So he's created the Joe Rogan University for himself, and he's gotten a lot of information crammed into his head. So it's not that he's uninformed, but he can always, when he feels that he's uninformed, or when it turns out he was wrong about something, he can always pull the ripcord and say, I'm just a comic. We were stoned. It was fun. You know, don't take medical advice from me. I don't play a doctor on the internet, right? I can't quite do that, right? You can't quite do that. We're in different lanes. I'm not saying you and I are in exactly the same lane, but for much of Joe's audience, I'm just this establishment shill who's just banging on about, you know, the universities and medical journals, and it's not true, but that would be the perception. And as a counterpoint to a lot of what's being said on Joe's podcast or you know, certainly Brett's podcast on these topics, I can see how they would form that opinion. But in reality, if you listen to me long enough, you hear that I've said as much against the woke nonsense as anyone, even any lunatic on the right who can only keep that bright shining object in view, right? So there's nothing that Candace Owens has said about wokeness that I haven't said about wokeness, insofar as she's speaking rationally about wokeness. But we have to be able to keep multiple things in view, right? If you could only look at the problem of wokeness and you couldn't acknowledge the problem of Trump and Trumpism and QAnon and the explosion of irrationality that was happening on the right and bigotry that was happening on the right. Um, you were just disregarding half of the landscape, and many people took half of the problem in recent years. The last 5 years is a story of many people taking half of the problem and monetizing that half of the problem, and getting captured by an audience that only wanted that half of the problem talked about in that way. And this is the larger issue of audience capture, which is very. I'm sure it's an ancient problem, but it's a very helpful phrase that I think comes to us courtesy of our mutual friend Eric Weinstein. Uh, and
So Sam will elaborate more on it here, but his assertion is that Joe Rogan is playing to a certain crowd, specifically the right-wing crowd, which I don't agree with, because when Sam was talking about how smart and informed Joe is, he was making my point for me and killing his own argument before it even starts. Joe Rogan interviews and welcomes everyone. He's not an ideologue, which is rare these days. He takes in more information from his interviews alone than most people get throughout their entire day. So even if he's wrong, with him, you know that you're getting an agenda-free, honest opinion that he believes to be true. So on something like COVID, where everyone has their own opinions across a wide spectrum, I think his opinion is as valid, if not more, than most people's. Again, whether he is right or wrong. Sam Harris used to be one of the very, very few left wingers that I completely disagree with, but I had respect for. But just like any time that I'm naive and let my guard down, I got burned by Sam because I heard him on some podcast, and I'm completely paraphrasing because I don't remember where it was, but he said something to the effect of Donald Trump is so dangerous that people should not allow him to be president by any means necessary. It was that extreme of a position, if not more. I mean, his TDS is on the level of Bill Maher and The View and MSNBC. It's bad. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
Audience capture is a thing, and I believe I've witnessed many casualties of it. And if there's anything I've been on guard against in my life, professionally, it's been that. And when I noticed that I had a lot of people in my audience who didn't like my criticizing Trump, I really leaned into it. And when I noticed that a lot of the other cohort of my audience didn't like me criticizing the far left and wokeness, they thought I was, exaggerating that problem.
Mm-hmm.
I leaned into it because I thought those parts of my audience were absolutely wrong, and I didn't care about whether I was going to lose those parts of my audience. There are people who have created, knowingly or not, there are people who've created different incentives for themselves because of how they've monetized their podcast and because of the kind of signal they've responded to in their audience. And I worry about, Brett would consider this a totally invidious ad hominem thing to say, but I really do worry that that's happened to Brett. I cannot explain how you do 100 with all the things in the universe to be interested in, and of all the things he's competent to speak intelligently about. I don't know how you do 100 podcasts in a row on COVID, right? It's just
Sam acting as if he's immune to audience capture is similar to me of someone that thinks or says that they don't have bias. Do you know how big of an ego you have to have, or how highly you must think of yourself if you believe that you don't have bias, or that you're not immune to something like audience capture that every other person that does a podcast is? You're the one special snowflake. I mean, just from that short clip combined with what I mentioned earlier about his TDS, it makes me wonder, why did I like him? And I think maybe it's because he has such a measured tone. He's not screaming and yelling, jumping up and down. So maybe I kind of got lulled into having some respect for him. And I like Jordan Peterson a lot, and I think they had respect for one another. So maybe I was just naive and I was like, well, Jordan Peterson's got good judgment, so this guy must be okay. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's what it was. When he talks about you're just acknowledging like the craziness of the left, but not the right, again, paraphrasing what he said. Here's the difference as far as I see it. The far left, or the insane, crazy, woke left, makes up significantly more of the left wing than the far right makes up of the right. So if someone really focuses on all the lies that we were told during the pandemic, like he was talking about Brett Weinstein, or they constantly rail against wokeness, but they're not really talking about the far right, it's not disregarding half of the landscape. Again, they've embraced that craziness on the left. It's only a very small portion on the right that I personally, if you're very extreme far right, I don't have anything in common with you. And I think that's pretty normal for common sense conservatives. On the left, they not only prop them up, but they fight for these crazy ideas and all of their nonsense social justice causes. That's why people are much more vocal about them, because you've got politicians and companies spreading, frankly, evil nonsense. Anyway, let's wrap up the video.
It makes no sense.
Do you think, in part, audience capture can explain that?
I absolutely think it can. Yeah.
What about, do you, like, for example, do you feel pressure to not admit that you made a mistake on COVID or made a mistake on Trump? I'm not saying you feel that way, but do you feel this pressure? So you've attacked audience capture within the way you do stuff, so you don't feel as much pressure from the audience, but within your own ego.
I mean, again, the people who think I'm wrong about any of these topics are going to think, okay, you're just not admitting that you're wrong. But then now we're having a dispute about specific facts. There are things that I believed about COVID or worried might be true about COVID 2 years ago that I no longer believe or I'm not so worried about now, and vice versa. I mean, like things have flipped. Certain things have flipped upside down.
Now, while I still hold all the opinions about Sam Harris that I've expressed, I will say that I believe he was on kind of the establishment side of the whole COVID divide. And if he's now admitting that he was wrong about some things, then he is a rare breed, because it's been my experience that if you were in that camp where you were ride or die for the jab, even with all the information that's come out about how we were flat out lied to, those people will argue it until their dying day, despite mountains of evidence to the contrary. So what I'm saying is, I try to give credit where credit is due. And if he's acknowledging he was wrong on some things in COVID, I respect that, because I shouldn't really respect that, because it should just be that people tell the truth about what they believe. But it's so rare that I respect anyone who's honest when they got something wrong. And I think that's rarer and rarer these days. But we want to hear from you. What do you all think about this conversation between Lex Fridman and Sam Harris? Let us know. Anyway, as always, really appreciate you watching, and we will see you on the next one.